If you love rubric grading, then this video is likely not for you because I'm going to focus on why I don't think rubric grading works as well as holistic grading, the downsides of rubrics, right? And so if you've been considering which books you want to take, then I recommend watching this video and potentially seeing why, again, holistic would be the better choice in a lot of ways. Right? So hi there, this is Erica from Ever Educating, and this channel is about teaching tips for new college instructors, ed tech and online and hybrid teaching tips recently as well. So if that interests you, go ahead and subscribe below. But again, 3 big reasons why I don't think rubrics work well. I know there are obviously a lot of types of rubrics, so I'm not saying all of them won't work. But the ones I'm going to talk about, which are pretty standard, I don't think they really take into account really important nuances when grading. So I'm going to go over 3 reasons why I'm not a big believer in rubrics. The first one is really practical. It's a really short reason, but it has major effects, I feel, on your teaching. And that's how much more time-consuming filling out a rubric is when grading versus doing holistic grading. Because if you have a rubric that has 20 different aspects to it, where you have to give up to 5 points for each, and you're doing that for each student, well, if you have 120 students or 300 students, you're going to be there for a long time filling out these rubrics, right? And because of the other issues with rubrics, this can take even more time than just filling out each little box. So I do think it's not very practical from a teaching perspective when you have tons of students to grade each time, especially if these assignments are very long and time consuming. If you're grading 7-page papers or projects that take half an hour to even get through, and after that, now you have to kind of really think of how many points are given for each element of the rubric. It's going to take a really long time in comparison to, okay, I read this thing, I've gotten a sense of how it went, and then assigning the grade based off of the overall holistic assignment that they turned in. Okay, so that's one reason, very practical. It's just very time consuming. I do have a video about how to speed up filling out rubrics, and I'll link that below. It's one of my Tuesday quick tip videos. But in general, I do think rubric versus holistic can be much faster. And you can still have in the holistic, here are the learning outcomes that you can look at the list of it and then make sure you're basing your grade off of all of them. But again, with rubrics, you're giving all these points and that can take a lot of time. Now, the bigger reason though that this takes more time and also that I don't think it works well is because of the fact that in my experience, so I had a whole semester now of doing rubric grading because of an assessment at my university, I feel that the grades are lower when you do rubrics versus when you do holistic, okay? And that connects to my 3rd reason why, which is I feel that rubrics aren't as nuanced, right? They don't really account for the flexible, big picture ideas of an assignment in a way that holistic grading does, okay? An example of this missed, nuanced, flexible part is I have my students do a paper, it's an argumentative research paper, and when they're doing it, okay, they support their argument with research, but there's also a lot of bias included, right? A lot of opinions included that obviously don't work well for an academic research paper. But in the rubric, it only asks about how well do they support their argument with research, and that's given a number of points. There's not really in the standard rubric any specific thing that says inclusion of bias, right? It's not built in when the rubric was created. And so now, do I take points off on the aspects that talk about research? Because they have research and it's good research, okay? So do I say, oh, you have good research, but, and then I have to do a little side note. I'm taking points off because of your bias, not because of your research, right? Because it's not set as one of the key things. So yes, of course, in future units, I can add it as a set thing, but for the current one, since they know it wasn't included, right now I'm adding things to rubric post receiving the assignments, which is, not exactly the best approach to take. So when you have things like, okay, well, I can't account for this in the actual rubric, so now I have to ignore it, even though it's very important to not have really biased opinions in a research paper, okay? So now the grade isn't realistic to the whole genre, it's only realistic to the standards I've set in the rubric, okay? So that's what I mean by a nuanced element of the assignment, okay? But then going back, now lower grades with rubrics versus holistic grading, what's that about? Well, obviously this depends on how you design your rubrics, but the one that I use, which is pretty standard, it pretty much involves scaffolding of the learning outcomes, right? And so if you have, for example, a learning outcome tied to how well they structured their paper. And so the first element is, do they have a strong thesis, right? Do they have a thesis that explains what's going on in their paper? And then following that, they have, okay, well, do the body paragraphs support the thesis as well? Okay, does the research in the body paragraph support the thesis well, right? Does the conclusion support the thesis well? Okay, so you might have these elements of a learning outcome. Now, what happens when, okay, they have this paper, and sure, they have an introduction that gives context of their topic, but they never actually state explicitly a thesis statement. They never actually say what they're doing in their paper. So for the first point, obviously, do they have a strong thesis? No, because it doesn't even exist, right? And so depending on how you grade, you might give this a 3 because you have a general sense from the intro about what it's about, but it's not really there, or maybe it's a 2 or a 1, maybe even a 0, right? Depending on how strict you are when you're grading. But the issue here is when all the follow-up ones are, well, how well do they support the thesis with the body paragraphs, with their research, and with the conclusion? Well, there's no thesis. So does that mean that for each of these other ones, they also get 1 or 2 or 0 points? Because in that case, now you have like 20 points that they did terribly on just because they don't have this 1 or 2 sentence thesis statement, okay? And so if you don't do a harsh approach, then that means you might give them a low grade on the thesis, but then after reading the paper, you get a sense of what their thesis is, and you base the answers to the rest of those elements on that imagined thesis. Okay, well, I understand after reading this paper that their paper was about this, and as far as researching that and supporting it, they did pretty well. As long as having body paragraphs to support it, they did pretty well, the conclusion, etc., etc. So now maybe they're getting 4, 5 points on these elements, even though the thesis is not actually there. So it's not truly accurate to your rubric if you do it that way, right? If you give them the benefit of the doubt. And so at that point, now you're kind of flexing the rubric in a way that wasn't anticipated, okay? So I really have an issue with, okay, well, if they're scaffolded and step 1 goes poorly, now you have to make a decision about all the other steps, right? And again, I'm not comfortable saying, okay, well, the thesis isn't there. That means all the rest of these points, they get below average because the first part wasn't there, right? I do not take that approach. I take the latter approach of saying, well, this is their imagined thesis. How do they do supporting that, right? If it had been there, okay? And so on. So I used rubrics and I made sure I kept to those, but the grades were much lower because I still had to give at least, I couldn't give 5 points in support of the other learning outcomes about the body paragraphs and research and conclusion because they didn't have a thesis. So it would be really inaccurate to say, oh, exceeds expectations of supporting your thesis when the thesis doesn't actually exist. So 4 points is as high as they can get on these elements, right? And so I really feel when you have rubrics, you can't really, understand that, okay, step 1 went poorly, but if it had gone well, all these other steps would have gone well too, right? Versus step 1 went poorly and so did all the rest. Of course, in that case, you give lower scores across the board, right? But that's the main reason I dislike rubrics is not just because it doesn't allow for the nuanced elements, but it doesn't acknowledge that when you're doing scaffolding grading, if you don't have the foundation, the rest of it's going to be terrible too. Does that mean they should get a C in this paper just because they're missing 1 sentence, right? Or even worse, if they're missing this 1 thesis statement. So I really have issues with this. I have another section of the rubric is how well do they do the research skills, right? And so again, that starts with how well do they find academic sources to support their argument, because that's a requirement, using academic sources, not just any source that's credible. And then the ones that follow, how well does the research supports the argument well? The research is well smoothly integrated into the paragraphs, et cetera, et cetera. But once again, if their research was Time Magazine and Sports Illustrated, right? Well, neither of those are academic sources. And so how well do they find academic sources? They also did poorly on that because they didn't actually find any. But the rest, I base it off of, okay, well, how credible were the sources they did find? And how smoothly did they integrate those sources? And I grade based on that. I don't say, well, you didn't have any academic sources, so all of these you do poorly as well because you didn't actually do the first point. Okay, so I that's the main reason why I really struggle with doing rubric grading. And I believe that taking a more nuanced approach of, okay, well, they didn't do well in explaining what they're going to argue in this paper, but they did well in including research into it. They did well in having smooth body paragraphs that link to each other and transition well, right? They have a strong intro and conclusion. And so they can still do really well on this assignment, even though they missed that central part, right? And so again, to me, this is why I do holistic grading. I have a whole blog post about holistic grading that I'll link below too from a while ago. But I'm curious. I know, again, there's different types of rubrics. Maybe you use a rubric that doesn't scaffold, which would surprise me, but it might be the case. So I'd be interested in hearing from the rubric lovers, if you did actually watch this video, or the ones who dislike it, right, who prefer holistic grading, I would love to hear your experiences with this, because again, I'm like, this is my first semester where I use rubrics across the board with the major units, and I'm like, wow, I do not want to do this again, because it took so much time to grade, because I had to say, okay, well, I have to make a decision. If they did poorly on step 1, what do I do with the rest of the points, right? Or I went through the whole rubric and I realized, oh, I didn't really account for if there's bias in here, right? I didn't really account for if, how many points do they have taken off if they don't reach the length requirement? Is that part of one of these points, or is it in addition to these 100 points that I now take off of, right? So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about rubric grading. And again, I'll link below all the related videos to this topic as well. So if you found this video interesting or helpful, do click like below and let me know. It really helps me on this channel. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time to do so. I'll see you next time.